Hi, I'm Dr. Samuel Sennett from Portland State University. This is part of Module 3 about qualitative research methods in SPED 596, Topics in Special Education Research. So we're going to dive into qualitative research methods. I hope you had fun with Spot and Percy stories. Special thanks to Diana Todd, the illustrator, who collaborated together on these characters. Isn't her artwork beautiful? And you see the Percy character, the Percy character on the left, and the green is so holistic and sensitive and such a good listener, so interested in how things work. And then we have Percy, who's also so curious, but very much interested in numbers and looking at results that they can quantify. But just look at this beautiful art, and we're hopeful to kind of get back to this, but I thought you'd have some fun, and it would just kind of, for you early childhood specialists, we were thinking about doing some stories for young kids to teach them about science and research. But really for all ages, I think you can come at this and kind of laugh and think about, we fight over qualitative versus quantitative research. Well, realistically, we can find that balance and harmony. So hope you like Spot and Percy and read the comic. In the past, we've had students write their own Spot and Percy stories. We thought it was a little bit too much for this summer. But if you do want the templates and you want to write a story, reach out to me. Okay, so with that as a bit of a warm-up or preface, what is qualitative research? Well, it can be a lot of different things, and I want you to just think about it in this broad way of collecting words, pictures, and artifacts. An exemplar study is this Early Start Denver model, a case study of an innovative practice. This is one type of qualitative research. I picked that study out because I know someone who helped out with Rogers and Geraldine Dawson's randomized clinical trial that tested the Early Start model. It's a developmental model, mostly for kids with autism. And so I thought it was a nice balance showing that you can do rigorous quantitative research, and then you can also do qualitative research on a similar approach. So a couple of approaches that I want to describe that I've had the most experience with. This concept of case study. I've read a number of case studies, and I've started conducting some case studies. This is where we take an in-depth look at a person or place, thing, or event, and we basically draw a circle around it, some area, and bound our investigation or our case and study that phenomena and look at it in all different ways. We can observe, we can interview, we can look at records. So I just wanted to show you these areas that I'm most familiar with qualitative research. Case study is certainly one of them. And then also focus groups. I've been running my own focus groups, and I highly recommend doing this. You learn so much getting to moderate or be a note taker in a focus group. But this is simply a directed conversation with a group. I wanted to highlight this right away because the chapter doesn't really get into focus group. It's a perfectly acceptable and very powerful qualitative research methodology. And here's an exemplar, and this is actually from my mentor, one of my mentors, David McNaughton. The title is "A Child Needs to be Given a Chance to Succeed. Parents of individuals who use AAC describe the benefits and challenges of learning AAC technologies." And this was a very collaborative effort, and if I remember correctly, this was an online based focus group. So just to clarify, you may have seen the TV show Mad Men. No commentary on Mad Men, but just showing that they show focus groups that are done in business or industry in that television show. And you may have a sense of focus groups as being something like a marketing purpose. Educational focus groups have some similarities to focus groups used in business or industry, but they differ on other dimensions. Educational focus groups typically include 5 to 7 and up to 10 members of the group, And it's really focused on getting at core ideas. It could look the same. You could be looking at an educational product, don't get me wrong. But it usually is even more collaborative than, say, a focus group in industry. And really, it's just the topic or the way it's conducted is for different purposes. That's what delineates it the most. I also wanted to show you this right off the bat in the focus group I led around shared storybook reading. We use the tool Atlas TI to code our data, and you can see the kind of very beautiful website they have, and it makes coding qualitative data look awesome. You can see this person with nodes and like a neural network kind of overlaying their face with beautiful, almost like Pacific Northwest trees. I mean, that looks cool to me. I want to have that software and like geek out with qualitative data. But this is what it really looks like. You have your text or your data, and then you can highlight it and basically put these codes. It's just a way to code your data, but you can code it in multiple ways and have subcodes to your main codes. And I just wanted to show that to you because for some of you, kind of seeing the technology helps get you interested in this. But it's just so cool to analyze what you learn from qualitative research. Okay, so diving into the 6 approaches that the book talks about, let's start right off with grounded theory research. This purpose is to discover and really derive an existing theory or generate a new theory that explains a process. And this is developed, this key term, inductively. And you probably read that in the text, and they did a good job describing deductively versus inductively. This idea is that theory is grounded in the empirical data, that you're going to get into interviews or observation, and then you're going to make sense of it. One approach that they use in grounded theory is called constant comparative method. And these, founders of the field kind of champion this approach where you're checking back in, this constant comparing or constant comparative method, where you're developing theory and then gathering more data and checking. And so when we, that's one of the real popular approaches and kind of terms. When we think about qualitative research, we think about the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data. It's typically narrative and visual. We observe, and it's used to gain insights into phenomena. This idea of focus on quality rather than quantity. I like the term holistic. The data is often non-numerical. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, you could collect some numerical data, for instance, with case study, which can sometimes start to tip towards mixed methods research, which we're going to talk about very shortly in the course. It can be a mix of collecting some numbers and synthesizing some descriptive data around the case or inside of the case. And so with Spot and Percy, we tried to introduce Diana and I tried to introduce the concept that not one approach is superior. Now, I'm a special education faculty member. Most of the time, special educators are associated with more behavioral approaches. We have in our sections this summer a lot of people seeking board-certified behavior analysts certification. Now, we may also have die-hard constructivists in this group. There tends to be this kind of approach in special ed where hard data and quantitative data is superior or thought of to be superior. And we get taught this. We get it taught this implicitly by being shown so many quantitative studies and looking at asking where's the evidence and the outcomes. And while I think this is very important to get to efficacy, a good way to litmus test this is just be like, do you want your medical doctor basing their practices off solid science and well-constructed data, or do you want them just exploring, right? There's certainly times when a doctor needs to really be innovative, but a lot of times you want them following what is known to work, what's scientifically proven through quantitative data. Yet, huge caveat, not everything can be put into numbers easily. And each approach is valuable in their own ways, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses. Both approaches are science. And so most, researchers, certainly very hip researchers like myself, just kidding, sorry, agree that, you gotta look at problems and choose the methods that are most appropriate for each situation. So it's best to begin with your topic or research questions and then select the method. So it's often counterproductive to be like, I'm going to do a single case design study and then kind of work back to your topic. That would be a quantitative approach. So some of the characteristics to consider with qualitative: that this research is natural or naturalistic, it's descriptive, and the researchers are often concerned with process as well as product. And researchers often analyze their data inductively, right? They're going to gather data and start to develop theory. And one of the focuses is looking at how people make sense and meaning out of their lives or their experience. The steps in the process are very similar to what we showed with this general process of educational research, but look at the subtle difference. So you might look at the topic or phenomena, you're going to review some related literature, you're going to ID participants, you're going to dive in and start to collect some data. That might be a difference already, where we might not have the intervention methodology, right? We might start collecting some data, we might start analyzing it, and then start to develop some research questions and really start to develop hypotheses about our theoretical implications of this data. And so we might then collect additional data, do additional analysis, and revise those research questions and go back and forth. In some ways, this fits really well with our design thinking approach. And as we're going to get into with mixed methods research, this can be an excellent approach to combine with a rigorous quantitative approach. So, and we're going to finish up with reporting and analyzing and reporting rather. And so, like I said, note the subtle differences in that process. The steps may go back and forth. They may seem a little bit out of order. They may overlap. You may have to jump around a bit. And there's lots of approaches. Some people say up to 30 different qualitative approaches. And this, some of these types, you might have heard these terms of ethnography, narrative research, historical research, grounded theory that we introduced right away, phenomenology, and then case studies, which I said I've explored. And often people adapt these general approaches for their own situation. And they intentionally emphasize the customization needed for their specific context. So ethnographic research, you may have a social science undergraduate background. I didn't realize how important ethnographers and social scientists are. I'm collaborating some with Intel right now, and they do this all the time. They leverage social scientists. They leverage ethnographers. And these folks in ethnographic research, they go in depth with their descriptions and their interpretations of phenomena and beliefs of a culture or a social group or a practice or community. And often the researcher really gets in and spends time in the setting, especially paying attention to seeing things not in a one-shot fashion, but over time. And I'm doing work in Brazil right now. I've been spending a good amount of time there, getting to know community that we're partnered with. And with ethnography, the assumption is that you're getting a real in-depth or comprehensive understanding of a community or a phenomena. Narrative research, another second of these 6 approaches that we're talking about in this chapter. The purpose is to really tell stories. And so, like I shared, that we're working with a group of individuals with complex communication needs. It's invaluable to hear their stories. We're thinking about doing some additional narrative research around their stories and then having them collect others' narrative stories. And this usually develops as a chronological account of an event or a phenomena. And the goal is really to increase and share understanding of issues. And in our case, related to teaching and learning and telling stories, for instance, telling and retelling of teachers' own stories in their professional lives. Um, and so this can be very similar to historical research, but this is where we might not be looking at something that's currently happening. We may look at the past and be doing some archival work, looking at data sets and records to tell a historical description of these events, occurrences, or settings in the past. We want to understand them and learn from both successes and failures. And so this can sometimes be used where it's impossible to get at data because things have changed, but there's something important to learn from the past. Um, and we're going to look for this basically validity of our evidence. So if we find some records, we want to look for evidence that those records are accurate or valid, right? This internal evidence and external evidence of validity. So we might find a report card and then we want to see that that's signed or that's the final report card, let's say. Another approach is phenomenological research or phenomenology. And I thought this was a little bit intense and to be honest, I really didn't value it as much. And then I started listening and hearing about this phenomenological work, and I just stopped in my tracks and realized I was completely wrong. This is looking at the in-depth descriptions and interpretations of experiences of participants, going through various things and looking at people's perceptions, how they feel about things. I recently read Dr. Kathy Hallory's dissertation research, and I cite it all the time now. It's phenomenology. I want to become a phenomenologist. Like, I think I was born to do this kind of empathizing with people. I think it's so valuable. It gets at some of the most important things that we need to know in our work. And again, it doesn't discount doing this rigorous data-based approach that, like, say, our lab does with AAC intervention research. It doesn't mean that any one approach is better. It's just that it's different purposes. This phenomenological research we're doing, looking at the experiences of people with disabilities, is giving us important insights. But then we need to turn those insights into action. And so there's a real balance in the special educational research world and what's needed. Okay, so we talked a little bit about case study. Yin is kind of one of the best sources of knowledge in this area for people like us getting into this. Stake is another author who's done a couple of guides. Robert Yin's kind of my person that I follow in this. I've got multiple issues of his case study book. If anybody wants to borrow it or look at a couple of chapters, I'm happy to share. So case study research, as discussed, in-depth analysis of a single restricted entity, some sort of bounded system or case. Could be one student, one classroom, one school, one program, or one community. Now, this is controversial, right? People are like, this is a mishmash of approaches. It's not really an approach. Well, I disagree. I think it's an approach. I think it allows for multiple strategies inside of an approach, but you're describing a case. Keep it that simple. So go to the book to table 6.1. This is a solid overview. And just to look a little bit more about this ethnographic research, ethno meaning human race or cultures, and suffix graphy meaning writing or a field of study. And this you might know from other social science areas. But we're really looking at human interactions in social settings. We're looking at groups. And so it's basically descriptive research, but it's categorized on its own because it looks at behavior in natural settings. It relies on these rich narrative descriptions. It's holistic. that it may have that constant comparative approach, or this inductive approach, um, and this idea of really looking at the context matters. Um, and this can be so broad. So here are some example topics of ethnographic research: faculty interactions in lounge and workroom, kindergartners' behavior on the playground, students' lives at school and work, and lifestyles of top student athletes. Okay, so I think that these general procedures, you're going to, be question driven or inquiry driven. You're going to look for a group. You're going to get approval. You're going to then really try to embed. You're called this privileged observer or participant observer, and you're going to try to watch and listen and really delve into this um, community life, I should say. And it's really hard. I remember people saying, "Don't do ethnography for your dissertation because it could never end." And here you see it could span weeks or years. And it's really, when are you done? Well, when you're done, when you get to the theory, or you derive enough information that you're satisfied with your inquiry. So that's tricky, especially for new researchers, to know when you're done. Strengths, or this is a very holistic approach. Concerns are about reliability and validity. That you're looking at this, there can be inherent biases. Can you really generalize these types of findings beyond the group that you're looking at? Well, sometimes yes, absolutely, and you could get at these really important phenomena. Um, and like we talked about, this concept of narrative research is really to tell stories. The characteristics are to focus on individuals, their experiences. It's uh, got this really neat term called restoring as a technique for constructing a narrative account. Um, and this great way to kind of drive your inquiry, and then what happened, right? And just keep describing these steps in this process. Um, and so there's lots of different ways to do narrative research. Three key characteristics: who's telling or writing the story, how much of a life story is being told or presented, and then is there a certain theoretical lens or perspective being used? Um, so this can be biographical, autobiographical, could be a life history, it could be a certain story, an oral history. Um, I think that you're probably getting the sense of this narrative approach. Um, and this restoring is this process for reorganizing the stories in a format that makes sense for the intended audience. Now, this could be very sensitive, as you can imagine, but you really want these narratives to be impactful. And you may include participants and researchers may be collaborating on these types of studies, narrative research and ethnography. Um, and so, again, the strengths are that you can go into great detail and you can describe things in rich, qualitative ways. But then the concerns are could take a really long time. Um, and so I hope this was just a little sample into what qualitative research is all about. And I hope you can try this out in your module exercise. And so I'll be describing that in another place. Thank you for listening about qualitative research.